Hello, chat. How are you? How is chat today? Got a bit of a different stream today, chat. Bit of a different one. The more things change, the more they depressingly stay the same. How is everyone? Tell us what you really feel, Michael. Don't use those ambiguous titles. Yeah. Today's going to be a different stream because we're not really going to be talking about Ukraine for once. We're going to be talking about another country. Another country caught between the machinations of Moscow and the predations of Western people who have a predilection towards children and all forms of degeneracy. That's right, chap. We're going to be talking about the plucky little Caucasian nation of Georgia. A small, never been myself, but have friends who have been. They said it was a very beautiful place. It has a unique little language, adorable little alphabet, nice form of Eastern Orthodoxy. But unfortunately, kind of like Ukraine and most unfortunate countries throughout history, it is caught between the machinations, the ambitions, the influences of its much larger and powerful neighbors. And Georgia, in many respects, is one of these countries to a T. It stands not only between the rupture points between great powers, but also the civilizational divides between the Islamic world to the Orthodox Slavic world, and maybe even the European civilization as well. It's in violent collision between the East and the West. Small country with an outsized influence on history, of which we'll quickly dive into, because I don't think we can really speak accurately about what's happened in Georgia the past couple days without a quick rundown through its history and its geography. So I've got a nice little helpful map up of the modern frontiers of the state of Georgia. Georgia, of course, is in the Caucasus. It is wedged between, as you can see on this map, down on the bottom the bottom left, you have Turkey. To the north, you have the various Russian republics and oblasts and federal subjects. The entire northern border of Georgia is covered by Russia. And then to the east and the southeast, you have Azerbaijan and Armenia, the other Caucasian states. So that is the borders of modern Georgia. But historically, Georgia is... where do I start this? How far do I go back? I'll start in the Middle Ages because I think that's kind of where it is apt to start. So Georgia sort of coalesced in the Middle Ages, mostly under the Georgian Bagrationi dynasty. That's what kind of formed the modern state or identity of the Georgian people. Georgia, being an Orthodox Christian nation, was sort of a frontier state between the Islamic powers to the south of the Iranians, and then as the Byzantine Empire declined through the Middle Ages, predominantly the Ottoman Turks, this sort of toehold of Orthodox Christianity in a region surrounded by the Islamic world. We have to understand that the parts that are now part of Russia, the Chechens and the Dagestanis and the Ingushets to a degree are legacy of this. Historically, Georgia has sort of been an island of Orthodox and Christian civilization surrounded by, to the south, you had the Islamic Turks and the Arabs and the Persians. To the north, before the advent of the Russians, you had the various Mongol people, the Tatars, and then you had certain Caucasian indigenous groups such as the Chechens, the Ingushets, the various Dagestani peoples, to a degree the Circassians. So Georgia was a Christian nation surrounded by Islamic powers throughout most of the Middle Ages and up until relatively recently in terms of historiography here. as part of that, this a sort of nucleus developed, because you have to understand is historically the Orthodox Russians, the Tsardom of Muscovy and Russia was far to the north, and the Orthodox and Christian peoples of the Caucasus and of the Near East had come under Islamic domination. You're talking about the Vilayets of Armenia, the old Romanoi of the old Byzantine Empire, who came under the ethnic domination of the Turks. And the Georgians kind of largely to a degree managed to maintain their independence from these various powers, from these Islamic powers for most of the Middle Ages. So as a beacon of Christianity surrounded by Islam, this is where a sort of, I don't want to say a myth, but a concept of modern Georgian identity developed, is that Georgia was a Christian nation beset by Muslim powers, and the closest independent Christian nations to Georgia were the countries of Europe, of the various principalities of the Romanians, Moldova and Wallachia, Hungary, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then as the Russians advanced from the north through the conquests of the 1700s and the various wars against the Tatar peoples, the Khaganates, and then against the Ottomans, Georgia sort of reintegrated itself with this wider Christian civilization, and to a degree to a sort of European identity as well, an Eastern European identity as well. And I'm going through this because it will come into, this is kind of from my conception where a lot of modern Georgian identity comes from, and concepts of where Georgia should be geopolitically and where Georgia should not be geopolitically. So the Russians come from the north, conquer the various northern Caucasian people, the Circassians, the Chechens, the Ingushets, yada yada yada. They all come under the domination of the Russian Tsardom and then the Russian Empire. Eventually, Georgia slowly comes under the fray itself. Parts of Georgia conquered by the Turks, which in turn are then taken by the Russians, or parts of various quasi-independent Georgian principalities come under the domination of the Russian Empire itself. And Georgian nobility largely integrates itself relatively well within this the Russian aristocracy of the middle and the late Russian Empire. So we're going into the late 1700s, into the 1800s now. Particularly as the Bagatroni dynasty, as I briefly mentioned, the Bagatronis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not a native Georgian speaker, of course. I can barely speak my own native language. But the Bagatronis become a prestigious Russian noble house, obviously maintaining Georgian identity, and other parts of the Georgian aristocracy sort of integrates itself into this Russian world. Just an aside point, Bagration, General Bagration, the famous Napoleonic era general who fought for the Russian army, is of Georgian descent and comes from a cadet branch of the Bagatroni dynasty. Most people will probably know of the name of Bagration from the World War II Soviet offensive that took the name from its Napoleonic era leader. So that is sort of a sense is that the Russian Empire was fairly good at picking out talent in various parts of its various ethnicities. The Baltic Germans, the Georgians, the Poles, parts of the Finns as well add into this. Then we come up towards World War I. World War I happens. Without rehashing it, the Russian Empire does not fare well throughout World War I. Although against the front against the Ottoman Turks, which is down towards the right hand, the bottom right hand, left hand side of the map. Forgive me, Mr. Metric here. There is a front there where the Russians fight against the Ottoman Turks, looking to take predominantly the city of Kars and the old boundaries of the old Byzantine rump state of Trebizond. The Russians relatively do well on that front through World War I, but of course the main front that the Russians are engaged in, the Eastern Front, with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, completely collapses by late 1916 into 1917. The revolution happens, the Tsar falls, the empire implodes, and various regional powers within Georgia establish an independent Georgian state, which makes some brief connections with the Germans. And there's a very brief period of Georgian statehood, the First Georgian Republic, which, whenever the Soviet Union begins to form, or rather the Red Army and the various Soviet republics that form out of the fragmentation of the Russian Empire, the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, reinvades Georgia and forcibly reintegrates Georgia back into what would then become the Soviet Union in 1922 with the establishment of the Union republics. So that is a very quick crash course through Georgian history up until the Soviet Union. Country that was largely, for a lot of its history, surrounded by hostile Islamic powers. Started to feel a closer affinity to a Christian identity. Christian in this area largely means European. Is another side point is, while a lot of the Georgian nobility became fairly well integrated within the Russian nobility and aristocracy, a lot of the Georgian nobility were Francophiles. A lot of them studied in France. A lot of them trained in France. A lot of Georgian exiles, especially of noble birth, would travel to France, and this helped build this kind of European affinity historically that certain Georgians have felt. In the brief period in which the First Georgian Republic existed, before it was annexed by the Soviets, there was a brief attempt by the Germans, before the collapse of the Germans at the end of 1918, to send forces to Georgia to try and prop up Georgia against the then raging Russian Civil War, in the hope to establish Georgia as potentially as sort of like a client state of the Germans and the Austrians. Obviously, that didn't happen, and it fell through. The Turks invade the Georgians briefly in conjunction with the Soviets. But nonetheless, Georgia falls into the sway of the Soviets and becomes a Soviet republic. Is one of the original signatories, quote unquote, of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So there's various revolts that go through Georgia through this earlier Soviet period, but they are largely completely crushed and destroyed. While there was a process of Russification of the Georgian people under the empire, that sort of took a bit of a leeway as the collapse of Central Russian authority faded away. Then whenever the Soviets re-established rule, as part of this crushing of native Georgian revolts, you then get a resumption of Russification, might be the wrong word, but a Sovietization of the culture and identity. And a large part of that is the resumption of the Russian language as the lingua franca alongside Georgian within the Georgian Republic. If a Georgian hopes to move to anywhere else in the Soviet Union, as anyone within the Soviet Union who might wanted to have moved out of their own national republic, they would have to speak Russian really to get by. So Russian makes a big imprint again back onto Georgian national life. And then we come into a bit more of the complex nuance of Georgia's modern relationship with Russia, because Vladimir Ilyich Lenin passes away in 1924. He never quite resolved the fundamental problem with the Soviet system, which was the nationality question. How much autonomy should nationalities and ethnic peoples have under a Soviet republic, under the USSR? And the person who replaces Vladimir Ilyich is a man called Joseph Dugashvili, more well known to history as Joseph Stalin. Of course, Joseph Dugashvili is a Georgian. He was raised in Georgia, born to Georgian parents, grew up in Georgia, went to seminary school in Georgia, committed some of his most notorious early crimes in Georgia, his bank robberies, his train robberies, which led him into exile in Siberia. So you have a Georgian becomes head of the USSR. Some people would say that it's ironic that one of the most fervent Russian nationalists in history was himself a Georgian. But nonetheless, he did not shy away from bequeathing some gifts to his native Georgia. alongside Yosef Yugashvili, you have sort of like a clique of Georgians, ethnic Georgians, or people who made their career in Georgia during the revolutionary period, come to hold positions of sway within Moscow under Stalin, in the Stalinist era. Not going to go into too many of them, but the biggest other example is, of course, Lavrentiy Beria, the man who would come to form the modern KGB, the man who overseen the most of the purges of the Stalinist era. He himself was a Georgian, and he was a friend of Stalin, who ran the security apparatus in Georgia that crushed the various nationalist and nativist revolts in Georgia. So you have this situation where the quote-unquote Russian Empire, the neo-Russian Empire of the Soviet Union, became, for quite a period of its history, was run by ethnic Georgians. But just before we get into the Stalinist era, under Lenin, Stalin was given the brief of establishing the national borders of the various Soviet republics. And these borders are largely one of the big reasons why we are where we are geopolitically regarding Russia today. People say that it was Lenin, that modern Ukraine is an invention of Lenin. I disagree with that in a number of reasons, both because that is intentionally an insult to Ukrainians to deny them their own identity, but also the borders of Ukraine were largely drawn by Stalin. So, not only did Stalin establish largely the borders of modern Ukraine to the west, and to a degree the borders of the east, Stalin established the ethnic borders across most of the Soviet republics. This is why you have border conflicts between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and various ethnic strife in Central Asia, because the modern borders of those republics, of those states, were established by Stalin along this this concept of trying to homogenize either various Soviet republics along ethnic lines, or trying to weaken some by siphoning off certain ethnic sections of the population into different republics. So, like I say, particularly in Central Asia, you have Kyrgyz, who are now part of Tajikistan, Tajiks, who are part of Uzbekistan, Uzbeks, who are part of Kyrgyzstan, who would rather be part of their own ethnic homelands, but were siphoned off to either form more cohesive borders, or an attempt in certain respects to try and weaken ethnic power blocks in certain parts of the USSR at the time. This happened in the Caucasus as well. And I would say, in regards to, well, just before we come into the Georgian section, just to touch on another conflict that's in vogue as of late, this is why there is big friction between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The de facto independent and very blighted, unfortunately, area of Arstak, of Nagorno-Karabakh, that is an invention of Stalin. Stalin was the person who established the borders, who passed an ethnically Armenian territory to what was then the Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic. And then whenever the USSR collapsed, well, the National Soviet Republic, the Republic federal subjects of the USSR became nation states, and they became nation states without recognizing the ethnic differences between the borders. So that is how Nagorno-Karabakh, despite being almost homogeneously Armenian, and the desire to be either independent or a part of Armenia, is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, and that is where the Azeri and Armenian conflict comes from there. In Georgia, you have a similar situation, but I think this is largely as Stalin aggrandizing his homeland. I think he added certain non-Georgian ethnic parts to Georgia as sort of like this, his sort of thanks to his the land from which he came. So this map is quite good. This map that is on screen, the terminology you might disagree with, but it says Georgian territories occupied by Russia. And we'll jump through most of Soviet history, because a lot of Soviet history is kind of moot, because a lot of these borders don't quite matter, because whenever they're all part of the same country, as such, whenever they're all part of the Soviet Union, these internal borders don't really matter as much. You don't need a passport to really, well, that's not quite right. You need an internal passport, and you still need it to this day in Russia to a degree, but whenever Georgia is part of the same country as the people of Armenia and Azerbaijan, ethnic differences don't quite play as much of a part, and it's a bit moot. This is why the Crimean issue didn't matter so much up until relatively recently, historically, because the transferring of the Crimean Soviet Socialist Federative Republic, yada yada yada, from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, whatever the acronym is, by Khrushchev in the 1950s. That didn't really matter because ultimately they all came under the Soviet Union. It was just an internal administrative border. And also, a lot of people sort of say, well, what about the states? And they try and analogize the Soviet Union to the United States in the form of like the different states. Well, you have to understand is that all these states, all these different Soviet republics that made up the Soviet Union, at the end of the day, they're all run by the Communist Party. They all answer to the central authority in Moscow. It's not the case of different states being run by different political parties. It's all the states are run by the same political party, pushing for the same end, with just a level of autonomy to countenance for certain regional variations. So that is why during the Soviet era, these internal borders did not really matter. So what happens whenever perestroika and glasnost comes, the late Soviet Union, the beginning of the collapse of the empire? Well, as part of the opening up of press and the breaking down of the central authority of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, you then have the parade of sovereignties, the reawakening of ethnic identities, especially in opposition to each other's. So the late 80s, you have ethnic clashes, particularly in the Caucasus. You have brutal ethnic conflict in Azerbaijan between the Armenians and the Azeris. There's a very vicious pogrom. I believe it's either independent or it might have followed the 1988 earthquake. But as a result, the Azeris effectively purge the Armenian population out of the city of Baku and most of what will become Azerbaijan. In Georgia, you have a reawakening of Georgian national identity against what they perceive as a potentially foreign imperialistic Soviet Russian identity. You have a reawakening of national consciousness in these areas, and you have this friction between an increasingly weakening Soviet central authority combating with the growing economic crisis and malaise of the late Soviet period. But also, alongside this, you have the various constituent power blocks in these various national republics, Soviet republics, start to flex and cause friction with the center in Moscow. So you start to see, for example, the Supreme Soviet of the Georgian Soviet Republic starts to pursue policies that are not advocated or approved by the Central Committee in Moscow. So then you start to get this friction between the regional governments to the national government, and especially this comes along ethnic and linguistic lines, trying to pursue this national awakening. And whenever the economic crisis really starts to take off after 1988 and the Soviet system goes into collapse, you have the economic crisis compounds this national awakening and this friction between the various Republican level administrations with the center in Moscow. So in regards to Georgia, you then have the problem of this Stalinist era redrawing of the Republican borders reawakens. And this leads up to why Georgia is of interest today and why Georgia has this fractious relationship with Russia. Georgian is not a homogenous identity. There are different peoples who make up what Georgia is. I've never been to Georgia. I've not spoken to Georgians at length, so I can't quite grasp what the analogy is quite to it. But I would say maybe potentially for British people to at least understand it is the difference between the various peoples of England, between a person from Northumberland to a person from Cornwall, as opposed to a Southern English person to a Midlander to a Northerner. That's potentially the way to look at it. Is they might all say they're Georgian, but there are fine differences between them. The Georgian is kind of a composite identity between a similar ethnic group that makes up a commonality. But alongside this, thanks to the work of Stalin, you have certain people who are part of Georgia who arguably might not should have been. And this map helps illustrate that situation here. So this map, as it says, Georgian territories occupied by Russia. Some people on certain, depending on your political views, might view that in a different way. The Soviet Union begins to collapse. You have the parade of sovereignties. The various national republics declare their sovereignty, but not necessarily their independence from the USSR. In Georgia, this falls into trouble because you have two regions that are added to Georgia, largely by Stalin, that are not populated by people who are ethnic Georgians and do not feel themselves to be ethnically Georgian. The first is you have a autonomous oblast. I believe that was the level it was at. The people of Abkhazia, the Abkhaz. On this map, that is the green and orange territory to the top right of the map, leading up to jutting up into Russia, up towards the city of Sochi. That is an area in the Soviet era was known as the Abkhazian Soviet Socialist Oblast or something like that. It was a subject of the Georgian Soviet Republic, but it had a level of autonomy in of itself. And then that part in the middle of Georgia is a place called South Ossetia. The distinction being on south, which implies that there is a North Ossetia, which leads to a dynamic that causes strife there to this day. So in 1990, while the Soviet Union is starting to collapse, Georgia is moving towards independence. You have the beginnings of ethnic strife in certain parts of the Caucasus, particularly between the Armenians and the Azeris. You have the very early rumblings of Chechnyan autonomism, which would then obviously lead into the attempts for a Chechen independence and then the civil war in Chechnya. You have a bit of ethnic strife in Dagestan. The Caucasus starts to simmer, and in parts it starts to burn. Georgia starts to move towards independence. The people of Abkhazia, the Abkhaz, do not feel Georgian. They do not want to be part of a Georgian state. I'm not too sure of the specific history at this time. It's very muddled, and whenever I did my dissertation on it, it was quite hard to find a particular reading on the Abkhaz situation, if they wanted independence for themselves, an independent Abkhaz state, or if they wanted to become part of Russia. That seems to be a bit open to dispute at this stage. I couldn't find a lot of good academic research into it on the Abkhaz case, but in 1990, you have a conflict, an ethnic conflict in Abkhazia, which is essentially resolves into ethnic cleansing. The Georgians and the Abkhaz begin a vicious campaign of ethnically cleansing each other. The situation spirals out of control. As the late Soviet Union completely collapses at the end of 1991, the Soviet army group in the area decides to become part of the Russian army. The Russian army sides with the Abkhaz, and the Russian army and the Abkhaz militia effectively evict Georgian state and armed forces from Abkhazia. And as a result, you have a de facto Abkhaz state, a mini Abkhaz state. There's about, I believe, around about this time, there was 1 million people in Abkhazia. That has since gone down to about 800,000. But for effectively, since 1991, 1992, you have a de facto independent Abkhaz state, and its independence is guaranteed at the force of Russian arms. You have a Russian military contingent that is based there. The Russians call them peacekeepers. You, depending on what side you take, you can define however way you want to list it. But nonetheless, Abkhazia's independence, what would be the right word? Non-integration into Georgia is defended at the point of Russian armed intervention. So you have a Russian army group in Abkhazia, which breaks off effectively a large chunk of Georgia to the north. Then you come to the situation in Ossetia. The Ossetia, in South Ossetia, To the north of Ossetia, I'm sure this isn't much of a large shock, you have a Russian federal subject called North Ossetia. They are inhabited by a people called the Ossets. They feel themselves a distinct nation. North Ossetians and Ossetians feel themselves as a distinct ethnic nation, the Ossetian nation. Historically, they believe that they are the descendants of the classical era Alans of sort of Roman era fame, the horde, the Alanic hordes, not the Alemanni, the Alans, very particularly. That's kind of where the Ossetians believe that their ethnogenesis originates from. The South Ossetians wish to maintain a union with their northern brothers and sisters in North Ossetia, but of course you have the problem that Stalin decided to draw a line between the two what would become the two Ossetian states, republics, and gift the southern Ossetians to the Georgians. USSR collapses, same story as in Abkhazia, but I don't believe it was nearly as bloody as the Abkhaz situation, but there is ethnic conflict in Ossetia, and at the very early 90s you'll have another formerly Soviet army group that then becomes a Russian army group, which then pulls in Russian forces from what would then become what was then the Russian Federation, or what became the Russian Federation out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union, which pulls in Russian intervention into Ossetia, South Ossetia, and like Abkhazia, you have this quasi-independent South Ossetian state that its independence from Georgia is guaranteed at the point of Russian military power. So you have two parts of Georgia that have effectively broken away in the early 90s as part of the Soviet collapse that destabilizes Georgia, that guarantees a large vessel for Russian influence into Georgia, and which would, in the years and decades to come, cause a lot of trouble and friction between Russia and Georgia, and increasingly the West. A little side note to this, it wasn't just these two parts of Georgia. In this map, you can see that bottom part bordering Turkey, you have a part that's called Ajara, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That has a very high level of autonomy, but that sort of became its own independence, probably too strong of a word, but it became a very highly autonomous region of Georgia. It often defied the rules of the central government in Tbilisi throughout the decades. It never sought outright independence because the people of Ajarians, I believe that they refer to themselves, they feel themselves to be Georgians. These are part of the Georgian nation, so they never wanted outright independence, but due to the various power brokers that took over at the time, they did push for a high level of autonomy from Tbilisi, and there was various diplomatic and political crisis between the reinforcement of central government control over that southwestern part of Georgia. So that's kind of the situation in Georgia going into the 1990s. So Georgia is an independent state. Two parts of Georgia have broken away. You've got a third part that is effectively almost de facto home rule. What happens? The first president of Georgia suffers a pretty brutal coup. There was a very brief civil war in Georgia in 1991 going into 2000. Of course, I get a message at this time. Just forgive me just while I quickly check this. So, alongside that, this very brutal coup and brief civil war in Georgia oust the nominally democratic, shall we say, Western-orientated government and puts into power Edward Shevardnadze. I'm sure my pronunciation of that is horrific. If there's any Georgians in chat, please forgive my butchering of your language. Let me just I should probably have checked this just to double check it. Shevardnadze, I believe he was a Soviet foreign minister. Yep, he was a Minister of Foreign Affairs, the last Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Soviet Union. So this was a man who very much looked towards Moscow and to Russia as sort of a source of power and influence and legitimacy. So the coup happens, he comes into power, then you sort of get the kleptocratic era of Georgian politics. Shevardnadze's rule, which I think is In hindsight, the Russians, to their cost, whenever they started to reestablish their influence abroad in places like Ukraine, in certain Central Asian republics, the Georgians tended to support people like this, people who held a certain level of power within the old previous Soviet administration, came into power over their new independent homelands, but often were very kleptocratic. They were very corrupt. There was a lot of nepotism. That, unfortunately, seems to have been how Russia curried favor and influence in certain countries through the late 90s and into the Putin era, until the mid 2000s, arguably to a degree might still go on today. The Georgian economy, like most of the post-Soviet republics at this time, it goes into a period of significant stagnation. Politics becomes very corrupt, very brutal. Alongside this, through the late 1990s into the 2000s, you have a raging ethnic conflict in a little place called Chechnya, which on the map, I've lost the map. Have I deleted the map? Where's the link with the map? I've lost the map, but up on the top left, if you can make it out, hopefully it shows enough, you will see that Chechnya is listed. Whenever the old Soviet armories were looted, the thing that helped propagate the war in Chechnya was a lot of fighters and a lot of ammunition and munitions that went to the Ingushetians. The Chechen militants tended to pass through Georgia through a place called the Panksiri Gorge. That led to friction from Moscow, because obviously the Russians didn't like the fact that the Georgians were seemingly turning a blind eye to this transport of militants and munitions into Chechnya. And also the issue with a raging ethnic and religious conflict raging across the border in Chechnya, and to a degree in Dagestan, destabilized these parts of northeastern Georgia as well. I believe that there was a period of Islamic radicalism that sprung up around the Panksiri Gorge, which groups like Al-Qaeda and I believe in more recent years ISIS have tried to exploit, because this is an area that is not well policed or has a lot of central state control from Georgia, but also potentially there was kind of maybe a blind eye was cast to these things because it caused trouble for Russia, with relatively little blowback on the Georgians for it. However, there were some instances of Islamic terrorist attacks, hostage taking, and arms dealing in that part of Georgia at the time. So that's the situation that we go through up until 2003. There is a disputed election, which is widely regarded to have been rigged, where Edward Shevardnadze is returned as president of Georgia. This leads to a large backlash from the Georgian electorate, which culminates in what would become known as the Rose Revolution. This is sort of your archetypical color revolution. A lot of Western support for it. Eventually, the Shevardnadze and the government collapses, and then we sort of come into the modern history of Georgia, because the man who takes over from Edward Shevardnadze is a man called Mikhail Saakashvili. And for people who are fairly clued into this, I can imagine the name Saakashvili is fairly familiar to you people. And for me, I think he is a despicable individual. And I'll go into various reasons why. But nonetheless, Saakashvili takes over in Georgia, and Saakashvili looks to reform Georgia into a Western state. Saakashvili looks to join the European Union. He looks to join NATO. He looks to completely modernize, quote unquote, and globalize Georgia, bring in Western companies, reform the military. This is whenever Georgia, I believe, adopts its modern flag. Before it had a, as a vexillologist, I have to say, it was a pretty garish purple flag with a little black and white flag up in Canton. Under Saakashvili, this is whenever you get the rather much more aesthetically pleasing St. George's cross with the four smaller crosses in the little white squares. This is all part of the quote-unquote rejuvenation of Georgia under Saakashvili. As part of this era, Saakashvili he cultivates a very close relationship with the European Union and particularly with the Americans. Georgian troops are deployed to Iraq to help the coalition in Iraq. American advisors come to Georgia to start training Georgian troops. There's a lot of American armaments starts to pour into modernizing the Georgian army. And Georgia is very decisively moving away from what would be considered maybe a Moscow-friendly, Russian-friendly, or leaning state under Edward Shevardnadze to a state that is barreling towards Western interests and Westernization under Saakashvili. So, the other thing is, this is kind of where the dynamics of modern Georgian relations with Russia sort of come in. Because you have a lot of Georgians view the Russians' military forces in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia as a poisoning influence on Georgia. They didn't like having Russian troops in their country, particularly Russian troops that were seemingly dismembering Georgia itself. So that was always going to be a source of friction and dispute between Tbilisi and Moscow. Under Shevardnadze, because Moscow kind of propped up his position under his corrupt regime, it was kind of there were sporadic incidents and conflicts along the borders of these states, but it was largely held under control because Shevardnadze sort of knew where his bread was buttered. But under Mikhail Saakashvili, that sort of moderation of the relationship was cast aside. You had whereas you had Shevardnadze, who was trying to play maybe a pragmatic or probably more of a self-interested relationship between Western interests and Moscow, you then get Mikhail Saakashvili, who is unabashed. Mikhail Saakashvili, if I'm not, I should probably have looked this up before I went onto the stream. This is a man who was educated in the United States, is very pro-Western, and it'll come out a bit more as we go into what this man has done since. So he starts to bring in Western capital, Western investment into Georgia, builds up defense and military ties, particularly with NATO and the United States, through his period as president from 2004 up until 2008. 2008 is where the big break point happens. So I'm going back from what I can remember, because I can remember the events in 2008 fairly vividly, because I've always been an artist for geopolitics. But the Beijing Olympics starts, and under the guideline, under the sort of international attention on the opening of the Beijing Olympics, Georgian forces attempt to invade South Ossetia and begin shelling border positions in Abkhazia. Weeks before this, there had been a build-up in tensions between the Russian and various National Republic troops and the Georgian militaries along the lines of control. There were reports of drones going back and forth from either side, getting shot down, breaching of the line of control by troops straying across the border. There was a ratcheting up of tensions, but it was around the Beijing Olympics whenever the full Georgian war began. So the Georgians seem to have tried to have invaded South Ossetia and forcibly reintegrated it into Georgia proper. The wisdom of this still puzzles me to this day, as it did at the time. Needless to say, this doesn't go well for the Georgians, because as I've alluded to quite a few times, there is a Russian army group in Georgia, and north of Georgia, across the border from South Ossetia, you have to understand, is this border between Russia and Georgia, it is mountains. This is the Caucasus Mountains. This is not easy territory to travel through. And Abkhazia and South Ossetia lie on some of the major passes from Russia into Georgia, which gives a certain idea of why the Russians are so interested in Georgia, because Georgia is kind of the gateway through which Russia can enter the Caucasus, or say in the reverse, if the Turks or other powers from the south were looking to enter the Russian Caucasus and pardon me, the southern part of Russia, it is through Georgia where they would necessarily have to enter from. So Abkhazia, you have the roads coming down from Sochi along the coast. In South Ossetia, there is a large famous tunnel that stretches from Russia into South Ossetia. You have the Russian troops in South Ossetia that begin fighting the Georgians alongside the Ossetian military. And then you have a Russian army corps decides to come through that tunnel from Russia into Georgia and starts to push heavily into Georgia. And then you have another Russian army group that starts to push out of Abkhazia and down towards, down along the Georgian coast. So the war, the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, what was it? It was about 8 days. Let me just quickly rehash my memory of this. Yeah, so 5 days. Okay, so technically it was 5 days, but it was about 8 days till the French negotiated the treaty. So as part of this is kind of the first time where you have Russian military action overtly beyond the borders of Russia. You have sort of Russian peacekeeping operations, quote unquote, in various other states, the Tajik Civil War, Pridnestrovia, of course, and other parts of the former Soviet bloc. But this is the first time where you sort of have this overt Russian military action beyond the borders of Russia without the invitation of the host nation. So you have the Russian army comes in and very pronouncedly trounces the Georgian army. The Georgian army in places manages to put up a fairly decent defense, but the overwhelming might of the Russian military just completely collapses the Georgian the Georgian defensive lines. As part of this, you have a Russian army corps that comes out of Abkhazia and captures the Ukrainian naval base at Batumi, I believe it is, captures some of the ships at port. Russian troops are well on the road to Tbilisi by the 3rd day of the war, I believe it was. They never make it there because the ceasefire comes in, but there are Russian missiles fired at Tbilisi. The Georgian army is pretty roundly defeated. Russia flexes its might. And Saakashvili, very famously, I should probably have brought up the video. In fact, let me see if I can just whip it up on the YouTubes now. Saakashvili. This is kind of where you get Saakashvili starts to really start putting up European flags behind his speeches, which would become a bit of a tradition in Georgian politics. Let's have a look. There's a very famous video of Saakashvili where the Russian tanks are effectively coming down the road to Tbilisi, and he is reported to be on the floor. I believe it was either to George Bush or Sarkozy, one of the two. No. Stuff like this whenever I start to have a brain aneurysm and forget what I'm trying to do. Saakashvili. Does anyone... here we go. So, I need to bring this up over here. And where's my OBS? I swear, I'm slowly getting better at this, chat, don't worry. Display capture. So, this is kind of the famous clip that Saakashvili is renowned for.
A ceasefire is agreed between Russia and Georgia, raising hopes of an end to the conflict. The Georgian president is over his next move. Is he weaker or stronger than before?
So there you go. Of course, the big thing to note is, like I say, this is where this flag starts to become very prominent in Georgian politics, which leads up to where some of the situations that we have today. So, as a result of that, Georgia's NATO ambitions are... did I show that video, or the video is a fixed image if you're trying to show something? No, it's shown up here, so it should be there. Georgia's NATO ambitions are effectively killed off to there and then as a result of the Russo-Georgian War. It is debatable how serious they ever were, while two large parts of the country were in effect completely separated from central government. But nonetheless, the 2008 war is kind of in hindsight, it should have been a warning sign for what's happened in Ukraine. Of course, in 2008, you have the Bucharest Memorandum, where NATO comes out and says that it encourages the aspirations of countries like Ukraine to join NATO, and you have a very strong rebuke from Putin against him. And the Georgian war is kind of viewed in this context, is here you have a bordering state of Russia that is openly aspiring for NATO membership. You have American military personnel on its territory training its troops. You have Georgian troops in Iraq at the time, actively helping the Americans. Then you have a Russian military intervention in defense of two breakaway parts of Georgia to reestablish the sovereignty of these breakaway parts and sort of flex Russia's military might and political determination against the West, that there are red lines that Russia will enact if Western interest tread across them. So Georgia sort of has to be viewed in this first light. I've often said in the Telegram channel that the road to what's happening in Ukraine, well, arguably it began during the Soviet period, but you can't really view it without viewing what's happened in Kosovo and in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia. But particularly, it cannot be viewed without what happened in Georgia in the 2000s and 2008. In hindsight, and arguably it shouldn't have been just without hindsight, the Russians actively invading the country and completely leveling the military of Georgia should have sent a very strong message to certain Western powers that the Russians were willing to back up their red lines as they did in Georgia at the time. Although it's arguable how much the Georgian military attack on South Ossetia was the ultimate was the thing that spurred on the Russians, because it was quite clear that the Russians had these military units across the border prepped and ready for offensive action before the Georgians began their attack on South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But nonetheless, as a result of the 2008 Georgian war, the diplomatic relations between Russia and Georgia are severed, and that remains to this day. There is not a Russian diplomatic mission in Georgia. There is not a Russian embassy. There is not a Russian consulate. There is no Russian diplomatic presence within Georgia to this day as a result of the 2008 Georgian war. I'm not too sure. I should probably just quickly Google it now. Is there a Georgian embassy in Moscow? Pardon me. No, until this day, there isn't a Georgian embassy in Moscow either. Both sides are represented by the Swiss diplomatic mission in each other's country. So that's nominally what the diplomatic relations between Russia and Georgia are at this stage. They're on the surface level, there are none. So this is where Mikhail Saakashvili sort of becomes the story of Georgia to a degree. He remains as president, despite the fact that the war, in fact, no, what was it? He was prime minister first, and then he became president of Georgia in 2008. But he remains president of Georgia up until 2013, 2014, I believe it is. And then Saakashvili sort of goes off on his own independent, very interesting story arc in of itself. Saakashvili is widely construed as being very corrupt, very politically nepotist, favoring his own party, doing anything to help his own party, to curry Western capital in his own name. And as a result, he leaves office in disgrace, and there are various criminal trials filed against him in Georgia. And this is 2013, 2014. Of course, because of the events of the 2008 Georgian war, Saakashvili is now rabidly anti-Russian. If he wasn't always, he is now sort of like one of these very renowned anti-Russian figures in global geopolitics. He leaves Georgia. I believe the Georgians strip him of his citizenship. He becomes stateless. Then the Euro Maidan happens in Ukraine. Saakashvili goes to Ukraine because obviously the post-revolutionary Ukrainian government, rightly or wrongly, becomes very anti-Russian. Saakashvili finds a new sort of grift, you might say, in Ukraine, where he finds a lot of where he can curry a lot of favor for his anti-Russian politics. He sort of leads a sort of anti-government movement in Georgia from exile, but also he is given, he becomes governor of Odessa Oblast at one point and is given Ukrainian citizenship. But Saakashvili does as Saakashvili is. He then is stripped of his Ukrainian citizenship, I believe, but he is definitely charged by the Ukrainians. I actually think, is this the guy I'm thinking of? I believe at one point an angry mob in Ukraine physically picks him up and throws him into a dumpster because of his renowned corruption that he got up to in Ukraine. Or is this a different... No, this is a different politician. I thought it might have been Saakashvili, but there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in revolutionary Ukrainian politics at the time. But nonetheless, he falls out of favor with his new friends in Ukraine, gets stripped of his Ukrainian citizenship. This is the second time that he's been stripped of his citizenship. There are various criminal charges launched against him in Ukraine, and I believe he then flees to the United States and sort of gets a asylum. Either in the United States or somewhere in Europe, I can't remember which. And he sort of is that's kind of the story of Saakashvili. We don't need to pay too much attention on it, but it's just to sort of chart the trajectory of him because he's quite an interesting figure in of himself. In the 2001, I believe Saakashvili returns to Georgia, gets arrested, is now put into solitary confinement, and has been there since. And this kind of feeds into what is happening in Georgia the past couple days. But nonetheless, that's the story of Saakashvili. So Saakashvili leaves government power. There is now a new party that comes into power in Georgia called Georgian Dream, which I'll have to bring up some things to reference so I can properly... Yeah. That's the party that sort of comes into power in Georgia, post Saakashvili. And Georgian Dream is an interesting party in of itself, with a number of conspiracies, allegations that go around it. As a result of the 2008 Georgian War, there is a very strong anti-Russian feeling permeates throughout Georgia. There are still pockets of pro-Russian feeling here and there, but by and large, Georgians are very anti-Russian. And as part of this, they view that the ultimate goal for Georgia, which leads back into what I was saying at the preamble at the start of the video, is that Georgians see themselves as potentially being part of a European civilization, being part of Europe. And the ultimate expression of that is obviously to join the European Union. So, with that angle, I think we are done with the map, which means we bring in the new image, which illustrates this growing era of Georgian politics. So this is why you see European Union flags draped across all of Georgia. Anytime there's an official Georgian event by the government or a Georgian state institution, you'll have the Georgian flag with the EU flag. Despite the fact that Georgia is not part of the EU, it has no basis to fly that European Union flag. But nonetheless, Georgians are so beholden to this idea that they might one day become part of the European Union that it will be the savior of their nation in many ways. They view sort of European Union membership as sort of a guarantor of safety and economic stability from the machinations of Moscow and its neighbor to the north. So, the Georgian Dream Party is one of these parties. It advocates for European Union membership, but it also advocates for a pragmatic relationship with Russia. It does not. Whereas Saakashvili was very hostile to Russia in his administration, the Georgian Dream Party and the government it's led views that it's not an ideal situation. There are Russian troops, quote unquote, in our country. We have problems with Russia, but we can either be an outright antagonistic, hostile neighbor to Russia, or we can try and form some form of relationship and have a quasi-positive relationship with Russia where we are not at outright blows with each other, while also pursuing our pro-Western and pro-EU membership direction. So that's kind of the nuanced position of the Georgian Dream Party. The Georgian Dream Party suffered a parliamentary split, I believe it was last year, and then a splinter group from that party is called the People's Power, which is a lot more nationalistic. It's a lot more skeptical of Western involvement, and I believe it's not as hostile to Russia in certain regards, but it's very much a sort of sovereigntist, you might say a de Gaulleist kind of mentality for Georgia, and that's the junior party that props up the Georgian Dream government. So that's the sort of situation in Georgia up until very recently. Guys, as I've been posting in the channel recently, there's been a lot of interesting things that's happened in Tbilisi the past couple days, the past week, all around what Western and pro-Western outlets are saying is the Russian law, and what the Georgian government has listed as the foreign agent law, and what Western interests are hopping mad over because it doesn't allow their NGOs to do what they would like to do in the dark. So what is the contention with this law now that I've spent about an hour laying out the background for why the situation in Georgia is as complex as it is? So, from my understanding of it, on the face of it, is if 20% of a foreign NGO's money is, or an NGO in general, brings more than 20% of its income from foreign sources, it has to declare itself as a foreign agent. It is then subject to various scrutiny, government controls, and government checks. There was a similar law that was passed. There was a similar law like this passed in Russia. I believe it was in 2019, called the Foreign Agent Law in of itself. See, this brings up the American law, which is ironic, which we'll touch on in a little bit. But the Russian law, it probably goes a bit too far in that even domestic Russian agencies must be declared, like, if a government, 2012 it was passed. The Russian law effectively labeled any sort of organization that got any kind of money or support from outside Russia as a foreign agent, and therefore potentially as a hostile actor within Russia. This law came in in effect due to the protests against the re-election of Vladimir Putin in 2012, and Western sources are saying that the Georgian law is effectively a copy of this. It's not. The Russian law, from my understanding of the situation, is a lot more stringent. Russian nationals and Russian domestic NGOs are labeled as foreign agents, are open to prosecution, to stringent checks, and all kinds of various legal ramifications. The Georgian law, from my understanding, is effectively like if you're more than 20% funded, you have to declare that funding open to public and government scrutiny, and also potentially have a bit more scrutiny on your activities inside Georgia from state bodies. So this law cuts both ways. If there was some kind of NGO that was operating pro-Russian politics, it would be subject to the same law. If there was NGOs operating American influence in Georgia, it would be subject to the same law. A similar law to this would be the anti-Soros law, to another degree in Hungary, where Hungary very much clamped down on the Open Societies Foundation and various Western NGOs linked to George Soros that were operating in Budapest and in Hungary a number of years ago. I think from what I've seen of this law, from what I've read of it, I can't read Georgian, so I can't read the original bill that was put forward to the parliament. But This law to me seems like a very logical and pretty nonsensical thing to pass. But of course, we live in a world of universal deceit where great powers have malevolent interests, and particularly Western NGOs have a very disturbing fixation on certain degenerate activities, particularly resolving around kids and what they should be taught and what they are told to be. But so this is what the Georgians pass. It goes into the parliament. It is a lot of the parliament doesn't even bother to vote or abstains on the law. I believe there's only around 12 parliamentary votes against it. It's passed into law via parliamentary majority. And then particularly the American embassy and certain Western aligned media outlets in Georgia decide that this is democracy too far. This is a democratic government acting beyond its brief. Despite the fact that there are stronger laws that exist in the United States, despite the fact that if there was a Chinese NGO operating in the United States promoting pretty horrific things, say if there was a Chinese Confucius Institute that was getting 50% of its funding from Beijing, and it was teaching young American children to be Maoists, or if there was a Russian university organization that was teaching children to become Orthodox Christians, I can only imagine the cries of execration that would be coming out of Washington against it. But of course, we live in an era where it is do as I say, not as I do. Alongside this, the European Union, particularly because the European Union is the manifestation of Byzantine malevolent Western influence. The European Union operates uniformly through obscurantist NGO influence groups, civil society quote-unquote organizations. Laws like this are largely incompatible with European Union membership. This is one of the reasons why Hungary often fouls afoul of the good praises of the European Union. So there is a lot of speculation by certain Western aligned commentators in Georgia that this law was passed as part of a grand Russian conspiracy to torpedo any potential Georgian membership of the European Union, because such a law is incompatible with, and I bloody hate this term, European values. And if you don't have these European values, you can't be part of European civilization and the European Union. So alongside this, you get a absolute screed of Western embassies, Western NGOs, and Western commentators. And I have to say, whenever I was looking at this stuff as it was going on, whenever I looked at the hashtag Georgia or the hashtag Tbilisi, almost to a T, every single Georgian, and I'm saying they're Georgian because they had the name like Navrozashvili or Shvili at the end, these sort of very stereotypical Georgian names. Every single person who was Georgian was preaching against this law and decrying the Russian law that had just been passed by the parliament, because, you know, that's kind of the new moniker that we go by. If you put Russian in front of something, it automatically becomes evil, bad. It's basically the new Nazi to these people. All the big quote-unquote Georgian commentators decrying this law. Whenever I looked through them on their Twitters, going through their bio, what did I find? Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Trilateral Commission, what was the other ones? Nonetheless, all of them either worked. Chatham House, the former employee for the French Embassy, Harvard University, Oxford University, almost to a T, every single one of these Georgians who were getting promoted by thousands of pro-Western American accounts and pro-European accounts that were just promoting their tweets and getting them tens of thousands of tweets and retweets. All these NAFO-aligned people all these Georgians universally seem to have either lived in the United States, worked in the United States, still live in the United States, still work in the United States, worked for an American NGO, did work for an American NGO, lives in Western Europe, did live in Western Europe, worked for a Western European NGO, still works for a Western European NGO, was studied at a Western or American university, and then either went on to work for either of these NGOs. Universally, that is how Western influence works. It infects the minds of these people. They go back to their countries of origins and they try to open it up to more of this influence. And it kind of speaks, this is my own personal take. This is probably a bit more biased than you guys consider my usual videos, but it's just nauseating, the stuff that I've seen coming out of this stuff. This law is advocating for scrutiny. If foreign money comes into Georgia, the Georgian government wants to know who is paying for the quote-unquote shame initiative Tbilisi, an NGO that specifically goes around and effectively doxes Georgian politicians who are against LGBT rights, quote-unquote, in Georgia. Well, you would think that the Georgian government might want to know what foreign interests are funding this organization to go around promoting this degenerate stuff in Georgia and is trying to unsettle Georgian society. The Open Societies Foundation in Georgia. I think we all know where that money comes from, but how horrific an idea that the Georgian government, and therefore the Georgian people, might understand where very well-moneyed ethnic lobby groups in New York are funding organizations such as these to operate in Georgia, to undermine the cohesiveness of Georgian society, to break down the homogeneity and collective consciousness of Georgian society, and promote Western European values. What a horrific idea such an idea, what a thing would be. This is what spurred the riots in Tbilisi the past couple days. So sorry if I'm applying a bit too much of my own personal take to it, but it honestly beggars belief. Just, I was looking through these NGOs, Tbilisi Pride, this shame NGO, and I was just like, it's the same thing over and over again, no matter where you are, whether it's the American embassy in Kabul promoting Kabul Pride, the Tbilisi Pride account getting generous donations from the State Department, Kiev Pride getting generous donations from the British, Dutch, American, and German governments. It's the same thing, promoting the same thing wherever it is, and it's just become tantamount. If you want to be a Western country, Westernization means you have to sign up to these very specific, very radical social ideas, and if you don't, well, you are not a civilized country, you are a Russian puppet state, you are less civilized than us, and we are going to try and overthrow your government or create significant destabilization in your country. Because this leads me on, because I believe what has happened in Georgia the past couple days, I'm sure most of you people have watched this. There was some footage at the start of the stream, the opening video of the stream, is that there was a large protest in Georgia, which very much looks like it was a color revolution. Everyone emerged, conveniently waving the same flags, Ukrainian, European Union, American flags. They didn't quite bring out the colored armbands. They didn't quite settle on what color this revolution was going to be. But the American embassy, which I'm going to bring up what they said, this was a statement from the US Embassy in Georgia, just so we get an idea of how organic and independent this shit show was. So, does that come up onto screen? No, I shouldn't need to bring that. Let me just allow the latency to expire so I can just make sure this is up on screen. Yep, there it is there. So this is the statement from the US Embassy to Tbilisi, Georgia. Today is a dark day for Georgia's democracy. Parliament's advancing these Kremlin-inspired laws is incompatible with the people of Georgia's clear desire for European integration and its democratic development.
Pursuing these laws will damage Georgia's relations with its strategic partners and undermine the important work of so many Georgian organizations working to help their fellow citizens. The process and the draft laws raise real questions about the ruling party's commitment to Euro-Atlantic integration. So that's what the Americans said. Because, of course, that's what the Americans say, because that's what they always say. Notice how it was saying that this will cause significant problems for Georgia's strategic partners, and how it's a backsliding of Georgia's democratic development. Because we all know that democracy, what's the saying that the New York Times comes out with? Democracy dies in darkness. So how dare the Georgian government decide to shine a little bit of light into who is operating in Georgia, what they're doing, and where they get the money to do it from. That's democracy Western style. That is Westernization for you people. That is, if you don't allow that, if you don't allow some, I can't say the word on YouTube because I'm pretty sure I'll get in trouble for it. But if you don't allow someone who has a pretty strong fixation on young kids and what gender they should be coming into your country with a lot of money from some very skeptical people and going into your schools or going into your local administrations and saying, hey, Georgian bureaucrat, you need to teach this in school. There's no such thing as Georgian girls and boys. There's only Georgian Z's and Zers. And if you don't promote this to your cohesive, homogenous, fairly orthodox society, then I'm sorry, but you're just not a Western country, sweetie. We're going to have to do something about your democracy. Because whenever I was looking at the footage of these people who were protesting, in fact, we'll play it again. We'll go back to the video, but I'll just turn off the music. There was a sort of, I didn't put it in this footage, but there was a sort of resounding theme that I sort of got from the people who attended these protests. And I see a lot of these people who look at pretty much like these people, with the same weird colored hair, with the same clothes, waving the same flags in London, in Berlin, in American cities, in capital cities, wherever they go, especially coming out of universities. There's a look. There certainly is a look to these people, and they're interchangeable wherever they go. And I'm not saying that these are paid foreign agitators. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that the people in Tbilisi, these people who largely seem to have come out and made up the militant part of this protest, they're a type. They're a cosmopolitan type, and you can find them wherever there's a McDonald's, wherever there's a university that gets grants from certain open societies foundations. They seem to metastasize wherever that stuff goes. And these people, do you think these people, these young, largely young, radical university types with weird colored hairs, strong views on LGBT rights, live in urban centers, do you think these people speak for the majority of Georgians? Do you think the peasant farmer out plowing the field has any affinity to what these people are protesting for? Do you think the people who live in Batumi, the people who live out in all rural Georgia, do you think they're really keen on having these westernized, I'm really struggling not to say what I want to say here, but these westernized alphabet people coming in and enforcing on them with foreign money what their kids are to be taught in school, what gender their kid is to be, what they have to accept as the social norm in their society, how what they've been doing, how their traditions, how their culture is actually backwards and how it needs to change to fit
this certain idea of what the world should be and what society and development and modernization should be, I'm very skeptical of it. Very skeptical of it, chat. I really am. But I've never been to Georgia. I'm not Georgian. I don't think I've ever really spoken to a Georgian person that much. But I kind of have an idea that most Georgians probably don't want Tbilisi and their country to become a new San Francisco, to become a new London. Maybe we'll find out whenever elections come round. But even then, it seems to be that a lot of the media in Georgia, because it's bought and paid for by these various Western influences in capital that the Georgian government was trying to shed a bit of light on, seems to have just lined up hook and sinker behind this protest movement. And they're not actually even talking about the NGOs. It seems to be that domestic Georgian media seems to be labeling this as is an anti-corruption movement. This is against corruption and it's against Russian influence in Georgia. It's not about shedding a light on these nefarious Western actors with their dark money promoting this degenerate and decadency in their country. So who knows? Who knows where Georgia will go, because it's turned out that the past couple of days is that the Georgian government has actually pulled the bill. The Georgian president, actually, come to think of it, I should have had that lined up to bring onto the stream. Let's see. President of Georgia, because she did an appeal, which lines it up, because the president of Georgia there's a lot to be said about that woman. She was born in France, worked in the French diplomatic corps for decades. And she gave an appeal to her countrymen. It's in Georgian, so I don't think I really need to play the video, but this is a screenshot, and I'll need to bring the OBS back up to show it, of the appeal of the president of Georgia to the parliament of her country and her fellow countrymen. So, stop the video. Back to display capture. And what's that? That woman is the president of Georgia. Where is she, chat? What is she standing in front of? Where is she? Where is the president of Georgia who is condemning her own democratically elected government and democratically elected parliament because it's straying off the road of pro-Western thought and pro-Western alignment? And where is she saying that from? She's saying it from New York. I'm sure she was perfectly reasonable. She's probably on some diplomatic mission to the European Union. Maybe she's on some kind of visit to the United States in of itself. But that, to me, is just emblematic. The only thing that would make that seem better is if there was a progressive trans pride flag flying from Lady Liberty in the background. Just the rot goes deep, chat. And this is how color revolutions come about. Because the Georgian government MPs came out in the past couple of days and outright said that they believe that the American embassy is attempting to recreate a new Euromaidan in Tbilisi. Despite the fact that, so the Georgian government, the Georgian president said she was going to veto the bill. So that was going to happen regardless, because the Georgian government, unless it found some kind of new groundswell of support from the opposition in parliament, was not going to meet the 3/5 majority in the Georgian parliament to pass the bill. So the bill was effectively dead. But even to assuage the outrage, the manufactured outrage in Tbilisi against the protesters, the Georgian government has pulled the bill. There's some speculation that the government might try and slip the bill back in at a later date, and I hope they do. I really do. But despite that, for all intents and purposes, the Georgian government has capitulated. It's freed everyone who was arrested, no matter what they did, no matter what damage or injuries they caused. Everyone who was arrested as part of the protests in Tbilisi have been freed in an amnesty, and the bill has been pulled from the docket in the parliament. Despite this, there are still protests in Tbilisi tonight. And there'll probably be protests going on. Hopefully, this has taken the air out of the protest movement. But there is speculation alongside this that this is just the beginning, that the Georgian government has shown itself to be an unreliable Western power, and that effectively that there needs to be a new Euromaidan in Georgia. The outrageousness of that in of itself cannot be overstated, because the Georgian government, this isn't Ukraine, this isn't 2014, where the democratically elected, although he was very corrupt and very dubious, President Alexander Lukashenko was overthrown in the Euromaidan because he leaned towards Russia and Ukraine wanted to go join the EU. That isn't that scenario here. The scenario in Georgia is there's universal political support for EU membership. The government wants to join the EU. The government isn't about to sign membership of the CSTO. It isn't about to join the Eurasian Economic Union. It doesn't even want to reopen the embassy with Russia. This is a pro-Western government, but it's not pro-Western enough. It wants to have diplomatic and economic ties with the West, but it doesn't want the social change that comes with it. It's not signed up fully into the globalized, paused reality that the West wishes it to be. So we're now at the stage where it seems if the window opens, is that Western, largely American interests will try to potentially overthrow and cause significant disruption to sovereign states because it is not pro-Western enough. It could be very pro-Western. I don't think there's really much more pro-Western you can get than trying to join the EU, but that's not enough. And we could be seeing potentially another Euromaidan start in Tbilisi against another democratically elected government. But alongside this, let's just have a little gander at something I had a look at before we started the stream. Let's have a look at the Twitter account of the European delegation to Georgia. I'm sure we're going to find some interesting things in this chat. So, the official Twitter delegation of the European Union to Georgia. Follow us for information on the EU in Georgia and EU for Georgia, a non-governmental, non-profit organization. I wonder if under this law, would this law even go far enough? Would this organization, this NGO, in under the law that's been pulled, would they even have to register that they are a non-government, non-profit organization? Or is Twitter is Twitter not Western enough? Is Twitter forcing this label onto this organization? Is Twitter not, is Elon Musk going to have to suffer a Euromaidan at the Twitter headquarters? Who knows, chap? But here we go. Let's have a look at what the European Union has to say. The European Union, which is led by the European Commission, which is elected by nobody. No one votes for who makes up the European Commission. The European Parliament has no say in the governance of the EU. It is handed legislation down to vote on. It does not make legislation. That beacon of democracy in of itself. Let's see what they have to say about democracy in Georgia. Calling civil society organizations in Georgia. We just launched a new call for proposals on free and fair elections, countering gender-based violence, civic engagement, civil society oversight, and much more. I wonder what they're looking to promote in Georgian elections. I wonder whenever the Georgian elections come round, what they will be demanding of that Georgian political parties have to do in their elections, what candidates they will have to run. I wonder who's going to be signing up to that call and what they're going to be advocating in Georgian democracy. What else have they said? We welcome the announcement by the ruling party to withdraw the legislation on foreign influence. We encourage all political leaders in Georgia to resume pro-EU reforms in an inclusive and constructive way and in line with the 12 priorities for Georgia to achieve candidate status. inclusive and constructive, unless you aren't fully on board with what they want. And then they'll organize a protest movement, either to overthrow your government or to enact concessions from the democratic operation of a sovereign parliament to its benefit. This is democracy. This is the democracy that Georgia is going to get. Not saying that Georgian democracy is perfect. It's had a few rocky decades, and I'm not an expert in Georgian democracy. But boy, this builds confidence in me for the democratic rights that the EU is renowned for that might be coming Georgia's way. Here we go. Charles Michel. This, can't say the word I want to say for him, unelected EU official, strongly concerned about developments in Georgia. Well, he's Belgian, isn't he? I can't do a Belgian accent, I have to do a French accent. Strongly concerned about developments in Georgia. The right to peaceful protest is at the core of any democracy. Adoption of this foreign influence law is not compatible with the EU path which the majority in Georgia wants. Commitment to rule of law and human values is a key to the EU project. Never, this EU project never properly voted and legitimized by the democratic will of the peoples of Europe. But I like this. It's nauseating. It really is nauseating reading the hypocrisy, the open hypocrisy of these people. Right and peaceful protest. Who started the riot? Did the police storm into the rioters, or was it the rioters who started storming the parliament? Adoption of the foreign influence law is not compatible with EU path because the EU works in the darkness. Whenever the EU slips into a country, it corrodes the institutions of that country via obscure NGOs, dictates from the EU Commission, which can't be challenged by national government, or else there's heavy ramifications, as what we've seen briefly in Poland before the Poles decided to completely cuck out to the EU and American interests, but most of all what we see in Hungary, where the EU is intentionally holding back money due to Hungary because Hungary is not playing the good boy, the little puppy that it wants it to be. Commitment to rule of law, the rule of law set by a sovereign, democratically elected parliament. I mean, I would have thought that is pretty stringent of a rule of law in of itself, but then again, no, of course, not unless the EU okays it. Let's have a look at what else they said. Oh, this is a pretty unbiased take, is it? What's that a picture of? That Habadon, that woman waving the EU flag in a riot in front of the EU Parliament. 8th of March is International Women's Day! And they're promoting this stuff. Like, if I was a member of the Georgian government, whenever they see this, what are they thinking? Well, they've just had what was effectively an abortive colour revolution attempt to overthrow it. And this NGO, this European Union aligned organization operating in its country, openly side with the people taking part in the breakdown of law and order, the attempt to frustrate the democratically elected parliament in its actions. And I'm not even a big fan of democracy. I'm pretty sure if you guys follow my stuff long enough, you'll know, absolute monarchy, despotism, based Lukashenkism, that's where I am. I'm not a big fan of democracy, but it's the open hypocrisy of this stuff. It really is. It just sticks in the craw. Who's this puff? And yeah, just the entire thing is nauseating in the thing that this promotes. Just nauseating. Just God. Which then brings me to the other thing I wanted to play, because it's not just the EU, it's not just the American government. The whole bunch of Western embassies have released various nauseating takes. Pardon me, I need to get a drink. The rage, the anger, the despair built in my throat. our good friend as well, has made a personalized address to the people who took part in the protest, because of course he did. Because if there's foreign influence out there, there is one man, and we all know who he is. We are all united in our common effort for a common victory, for our common European values, for our common human rights. And he has intruded himself upon the situation in Georgia. So let's hear from Zelensky.
Хочу подякувати усім, хто цими днями на площах і вулицях Грузії тримав українські прапори. Хочу подякувати за наш національний гімн, який лунав у Тбілісі. І це повага до України. І я хочу висловити щиру повагу до Грузії. Немає такого українця, який не бажав би успіху нашій дружній Грузії, демократичного успіху, європейського успіху. Ми хочемо бути в Євросоюзі і будемо. Ми хочемо, щоб Грузія була в Євросоюзі, і я впевнений, буде. Ми хочемо, щоб Молдова була в Євросоюзі, і я впевнений, буде. На це заслуговують всі вільні народи Європи.
Incredible. It's like they all line up. They all line up at once to promote the same thing. They're coming for your children. Gay marriage is non-negotiable. All the same people are all tied into the same thing, promoting the same ideas, the same policies. Which will then bring us into, why does Georgia have a particular interest in, well, why does Ukraine have a particular interest in Georgia? And this has popped up occasionally in the channel as well. But I go back to what I was saying. The current Georgian government wants a non-hostile relationship with Russia. It looks for a pragmatic approach of its relations with Russia, bearing in mind that it refuses to have diplomatic relations with Russia, because this is the page for the Russian embassy in Georgia, which doesn't exist. It's closed down. The building is empty. There's no one in there. There's no one been in the Russian embassy in Georgia since 2008. This is it in English, but because I translated it. But as you can see, section of interest of the Russian Federation at the Embassy of Switzerland in Georgia. The Swiss represent Russia in Georgia and Georgia in Russia. So it's not exactly very close relationships between the Georgian government and Russia. And the Georgian government doesn't want an outright hostile relationship between both countries, but nonetheless, as you can see, in connection with the demonstration taking place in large cities of Georgia, we ask Russian citizens to avoid areas of their holding and be extremely careful. Because there's a lot of hatred for Russians in Georgia, but there are a lot of Russians in Georgia for various reasons. And we'll start to ponder into why. Why is this situation in Georgia? Pardon me. Oh, I need another drink. Why is this situation in Georgia of such interest to Ukraine? And I don't think it's very realistic, this claim, but there's a lot of people who seem to claim that Georgia needs to open up another front against Russia, as if the Georgian army should just start marching back into South Ossetia and Abkhazia again. I don't think that's very realistic. The Georgian army is fairly recovered from the 2008 war. On its books, it seems to have quite a decent allotment of equipment, but how it would fare in a war, who knows? And I don't think the Russians have the manpower or the equipment necessary to immediately rebuff any revanchist Georgian ambitions on Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But that's sort of like the dream that NAFO types have for Georgia. They want Georgia to start war with Russia again. The Georgian government doesn't want this, because I think the Georgian government wisely understands that that'd be not a very winning strategy for Georgia in general. One, starting a war with Russia while Russia is gearing up to a total war, probably not the best idea, even if the Russian military is not what we all thought it was, and it's largely preoccupied by Ukraine. Probably not the best idea for a country that's fairly small in population and size and economy. But also, you have the Abkhazians, who very, very especially would not willingly reintegrate back into Georgia, and they have their own military. You have the South Ossetians, who are the same. You have the South Ossetians, who actively want to become part of the Russian Federation. They want to reunify with the North Ossetians to create a Ossetian national republic that's a federal subject of the Russian Federation. The Abkhazians wish to maintain their independence, but nonetheless, these are not people who are going to be very easily reintegrated or conquered by Georgia, added on top of Russian military action. So that's probably one of the big reasons why the Georgians aren't keen to march off to war. But alongside this, you have a lot of Georgians who are fighting in Ukraine. There is a thing called the Georgian Legion. It is one of the largest foreign contingents fighting for the Ukrainians in Ukraine. They seem to be very competent fighters. From battle reports that I've seen throughout the year, they seem to be very well. They seem to equip themselves very well. They fight well. They're fairly well organized, and they're committed to the fight. The Georgian Legion was one of the first to allow in Western volunteers and the like. But the Georgian Legion does not have the support of the Georgian government. The Georgian government isn't going to arrest them whenever they return to Georgia, but it will never provide outright support to them, because the Georgian government understands that it is not in a friendly neighborhood, is that it does not want an antagonistic relationship with Russia, is while it might allow its citizens to go off and fight and die in Ukraine, that is not with the sanction of the Georgian nation, of the Georgian government. Very wisely, in my view. But the Ukrainian, certain elements within Ukraine, and particularly pro-Ukrainian Western sources, seem to be fixated on this idea of varying degrees of extremity. That on one extreme end, I've seen people advocate that the Georgian Legion should go back to Georgia and effectively hold a military coup and take over the country and then declare war on Russia. To the other, that Ukraine should, not Ukraine, but that Georgia should provide outright military support to Ukraine, which both is pretty insane to me. Whereas Georgia just wishes to remain a neutral country, sees its future in the EU, but doesn't want a outright hostile relationship with Russia. But even that's too far for these kind of people, and that's probably why you get the likes of Zelensky butting in, because you have to understand the modern Ukrainian government. Where is it? Where did it come from? Came from the Euromaidan. That is where the modern foundation of modern Ukraine, of its legitimacy, of its inspiration, it comes from. So what does it see happening in Tbilisi? It sees probably what it views as a sister movement is, oh, you have an anti-Russian revolutionary movement potentially in Tbilisi that might bring in a friendly government that might support us and help fight the Russians. That's probably what the Ukrainian angle is looking at. Can't fault the Ukrainians for that. They're fighting a war for national survival, I guess, is how they view it. Can't fault the Ukrainians for looking out for their own national interests. But the thing that gets me is whenever you have Western interests egging this along, promoting this, funding this, that's where I really start to get frustrated and very annoyed at this. Because this is poking areas of the world that are not very stable, that have a lot of problems. And you have a Russia. Some people might not like to hear this, but personal take here. I think the Russians have gotten far in over their head in Ukraine. I really do. And they are feeling increasingly backed into a corner. And if the Georgians insanely decide to join the war, I think that's whenever you really start to see the Russians start to look at very radical and very extreme solutions to ensure its own national interests. I'm not going to speculate on what those might be, but I think that's whenever you really start to see the Russians. Because at the moment, I think Moscow is still fighting this war half-assed. It's still, the economy isn't exactly at a total war. There's a lot more men could be mobilized. There's a lot more that I think the Russians could conceivably do to bolster its war effort and really destabilize things. Well, if there's a new war that drags them in the Caucasus, via overt Ukrainian and Western support in Georgia, I think that's whenever you'll start to see Putin, Moscow, and Russia really start to get some itchy trigger fingers on certain weapons that it has, and start to pull out some very radical solutions. So that's what's happening in Georgia, is you sort of have this idea of expanding the conflict potentially to encompass. This is what's happened in Moldova recently with the issue around Pridnestrovia. Is you have people with this idea that, well, while the Russians are bogged down in Ukraine, this might be the time to clean house of all the frozen conflicts where Russia is involved in Pridnestrovia, Moldova, and in Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, in Azerbaijan, Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh. This is kind of where it's viewing, and the Russians aren't, I often criticize the Russians for being incompetent and not being what they should be, but I think the Russians are cognizant that they're not in a very good place, and they have very particularly strong interests in the Caucasus. And if some people do some very foolish things in the Caucasus to try and upturn the delicate balance that's there, I don't think the Russians will respond to that very well. And it would not be to the benefit of anyone living in that region, or potentially to the global order as well. Because you've also got the Chinese who are paying very close attention to this. If they see Western interests provoking new wars to drag the Russians in, well, that's going to send a very strong and very pertinent message to China that, either we can stand by with what we're doing and providing to the Russians and just keep it at its current level and allow the Russians effectively to be completely closed out in the Caucasus and in Eastern Europe. Or maybe we need to start hedging our bets here. A completely hobbled Russian puppet state might be good for us, but at the same time, a completely hobbled, defined Russia that carries no influence outside of its borders probably isn't in our interest. Maybe it's time for us to start sending the Russians something a bit more than MREs and non-lethal military aid. That's kind of how I view this, is that what's happening in Georgia is part of this escalation, a Western attempt to escalate the situation with Russia. And this is probably one of my most my own political views and my own personal take streams, but that's kind of how I see it. Fuck it, I'll say it. The Western interests want pedophiles in Georgia to be able to have unfettered access to kids like they promote in their own countries. And if you don't sign up to that, you're not a Western country, and Western interests are going to try and either overthrow you or frustrate your own political system to ensure that happens. Because it's where we live in. We're the bad guys, chat. If you're in Western Europe and North America, not saying the Russians are the good guys, because they're not. They're doing some pretty fucked up shit themselves, but I don't think there is any good guys in this story. Everyone's got some seedy, subversive interest that they're out for, and it revolves from either cultural and ethnic genocide, or it goes right down to wanting your kids to be diddled by you know who's. I've probably said too much on YouTube as it is. So, and the other thing to consider is that there are a lot of Russians in Georgia, which I've briefly mentioned. Georgia, as part of this sort of pragmatic relationship with Russia, has a very generous visa regime with Russians. I believe Russians can come to Georgia and stay for a year. There's very generous tax allowances, visa regimes for Russians nationals in Georgia. So some of those Russians have started to return to Russia. A lot of these people are people who escaped the draft. Your sort of liberal Russians. Some Russians have actively taken part in the protests in Tbilisi, but some Russians are feeling, apparently, from what I've read, some Russians are starting to go back to Russia because of the hostile situation that's developed in Georgia as a result of this. Ultimately, I guess a lot of these people would be rightfully considered traitors in Russia. So, just that aspect. But alongside this, I've also seen a couple of Western accounts have been promoting the idea that the Russians living in Georgia are a fifth column and that Georgians need to effectively exorcise them from the country because, being Russian, they are naturally stooges of Moscow. It's strange how Western interests, their view on immigration is often changes to fit their politics in whatever situation. Unfettered Islamic immigration into Europe can only be a good thing, but Russian immigrants anywhere is naturally a national security threat. So, someone's briefly mentioned it in the chat. I might pick up on this. I don't know too much about the situation, but I think there is an element of it. There are significant protests in Israel at the moment. Some people might be shocked by this, but there's been a parting of the ways between Israel and the Biden administration in Western states. After recent Israeli elections, the Netanyahu government returned to power. They went into coalition with a very radical Orthodox Jewish group called the Kahanists. They're pushing back on certain unfettered social not rights, but what can I say? The alphabet people who often live in Tel Aviv are very upset by some of the stuff that this new government is coming out with. The Israeli government's being accused of democratic blacksliding and all this kind of stuff. Not a big fan of Netanyahu by any means, or of Israel in general, but it has been quite telling that the certain elements of the Israeli government have been coming out and saying that the British and the American government are trying to overthrow it.
Takes a lot of chutzpah, chat. Takes a lot of chutzpah
for the Israelis to say that, but I think this kind of feeds into the idea that the Western governments led by the United States, this Western values, has come to such a level where even longtime partners such as Israel are starting to feel the cold shoulder because they're not allowing San Francisco style social norms to propagate in their countries. That seems to be where we're going to, where even Israel now is starting to feel, I'm sure they'll always get the aid and the money they need. I really do. But I do think that we are approaching that era where American influence abroad is unironically, and I know this has been a meme for a while, but American influence abroad and Western influence abroad is measured by the tolerance for things like alphabet people, for certain views on immigration, for certain social and cultural views. I really am starting to view that this is the new norms for Western diplomacy and how the West will conduct itself to various states. So, I don't know too much about the Israeli situation. Don't pay too much to Israel, but that's just something that is running alongside this, which I think potentially feeds into this. Which also, while it's just popped into the back of my head, they're also going at the Hungarians again. Can I bring up that tweet that I am specifically thinking of? US aid Hungary. Is that the woman there? Is this her? No, that's not her. If anyone's got the woman I'm looking for, the US aid official who's currently going around Budapest holding meetings with the LGBTQ plus PEDIO lobby. I prefer to actually have it up so I could show you guys as opposed to just trying to fire it off the cuff. I can't find it, but Western NGOs are starting to get their claws back into Hungary in a large way. US aid is the big one that's been going about quite a lot. Here we go. A woman called Samantha Power. This just... Let's have a look at what US aid has to say about Hungary. Where is my OBS? Does that... So, this is what this woman has to say about Hungary. Democratic country. Part of a European country. Let's see what they have to say.
As U.S. State Administrator, I have the chance to travel all around the world to engage with people who are working every day to strengthen democratic institutions, to build independent media, and to promote and protect human rights. I'm here in Hungary, one of the countries in Central Europe where USA has recently relaunched programming to tackle just these challenges. I'm going to spend the next couple days engaging with Hungarians about their vision for a brighter future. As USA
A brighter future. Do you want to know what kind of bright? Oh, she's an Irish immigrant. Is she actually Irish, or is she like 16% Irish? You can never really tell with Americans, but let's have a look at what she was doing in Hungary. What is the double audio? Apologies, I didn't account for that. Apologies, that's on my end. Oh, here she is. She's in Vietnam. I wonder what she was promoting in Vietnam, but let's have a look at what she was doing in Hungary. Who was she speaking to in Hungary? Where is it? Where's her? God, she posts some shit, doesn't she? How long ago was this post? 9th of February, so I have to go back a month. Turn your mic off by... Yeah, I know, I apologize. I didn't account for that. That was my bad. I'll replay the video whenever we go through it. What's this? Oh yeah, if you don't know, the Ukrainian parliament is going to vote on legalizing gay marriage. So there you go. Ukraine is going to become a Western state. Moldova, this woman, Sandu, there you go. Moldova, not a European nation, not a European Union state, but like Georgia and Saakashvili, EU flags everywhere. Irish forum. Is this woman, is she actually Irish, or is she like 16% Irish? Right. I hate these people so much. Honestly, it's... How many times could she tweet about turning kids into fucking shrooms? Right, so... Here we go. We're at the Hungarian tweets here. So, I'll replay this message again. I'll turn off my audio so you guys can properly hear it. Apologies, that was bad on my end.
As U.S. State Administrator, I have the chance to travel all around the world to engage with people who are working every day to strengthen democratic institutions, to build independent media, and to promote and protect human rights. I'm here in Hungary, one of the countries in Central Europe where USAID has recently relaunched programming to tackle just these challenges. I'm going to spend the next couple days engaging with Hungarians about their vision for a brighter future.
So who did she speak to in Hungary? Kicked off with young Hungarians. So there you go. Claws straight into the youth. But where is it? There was one tweet where... Promote human dignity. We all know what that's a code word for. I think she's deleted it. Yeah, I think she's deleted it because one of these groups she met with was actually the LGBT lobby in Hungary, and she was pressing about rights for LGBT peoples in Hungary, in Budapest. Of course, people who understand the situation will know whenever people talk about LGBT rights in Budapest, is they're talking about the propagation of LGBT and gender ideology in schools to children. That's what the sort of slip of the code word is whenever people talk about that. But yeah, US aid is now becoming active again in Hungary, and Soros organizations, I believe, are still banned, but the Americans and what European NGOs are slowly starting to get their tentacles back into Hungary. So hopefully Orban wakes up to this and rapidly evicts these subversive international influences from his country, because I have such hopes for Hungary. I really do. The only country that might actually that might weather the storm. So with that, I think that is everything that I was looking to touch on. So what are you guys saying? What's chat saying? So let's have a look. Bunker housing for 20 Swedish krona. The UN are the good guys. Yeah, they always are. Whoa, short feral for $200 US. Thank you so much, man. That's far too generous. Thank you. Best stream yet, Michael. Thank you. Honestly, bro, that's so generous. I'm probably gonna have to actually now get in and put my tax information into YouTube so I can actually start getting my money out of it now. Thank you so much, man. That's honestly so generous. Turn off your mic when playing vids. I was just gonna miss. Yeah, okay. She's an actual Irish immigrant, according to early life check, raised in USA after 9 years old, so culturally Yankee. God. It's just so bad. Why are you not reading super chats? Why? I don't tend to interrupt the stream. Sorry, I do try to get through them whenever I can. Can you do a quick update on Bakhmut and Volhodar? I was kind of hoping potentially not to talk about Ukraine. I was kind of gonna save it for my own stream, but I guess I'll give a very, very brief update on what's happened. So I wasn't planning on bringing up the map, but we'll have a quick look at what's happened the past few days. So not too sure what's happened around Volhodar. There's some indication that Russians might be fighting in the built up area. Some dispute about that, so who knows what the situation, but there was definitely Russian troops in the Dakha area recently. But I'm not too sure on the situation in the area generally as of yet. Up in Bakhmut, lines seem to be fairly static. Wagner seems to be constantly frustrated at trying to actually close the pockets. Ukrainians are feeding in men and material. Counterattacks are building up against Wagner's southern prong is the main one, but slowly there is a buildup of Ukrainian kinetic resistance on the southern prong as well. But Wagner took over. Which town was it? Was it this one? It wasn't Orkovo. I think it was this town, Dubovo Vasilivka. I think this is the town that Wagner took, if I'm not mistaken. I believe they took over this hamlet recently. It definitely wasn't Bohorodamka, because we would have heard of that, to be honest. But they took over some small town in the area, but largely the front seemed to be fairly static from what I can see. Wagner took part of this area, and they've completely secured the eastern bank, which is reflected in this map from my understanding. So it's incremental gains in the north, but I believe that there was a section of the southern part of the city that they took as well. But I don't think the big story the past couple of days was what happened in Bakhmut, actually. I think the Russians are starting to engage in positional battles further to the south. But let's have a look to the north. Is there any big developments on the north that I've missed? I don't think so. Oh, the other thing was, is this the town here? Or is it a bit further north? I think it was this town. Ukrainian forces were... no, it was this town here. Ukrainian forces seem to be active in this town. There was video footage of 5 Russian tanks destroyed on the eastern environs of the town. This means they've cut the P66 highway. Pretty bad for Russia, as this is a major logistics route coming down to the Crimea axis all the way up from Russia. So that's not good for Russia. Haven't heard anything else out of the area at the moment, but that's probably something to watch, because I would imagine the Russians are probably going to want to retake full control and access of this road soon. But the big thing I was paying attention to recently is actually around the town of Avdiivka. Some interesting developments there. Where am I? Bakhmut. Avdiivka. New York. Here we go. I think the Russians are starting to put in place positional battles for future developments. I think if and when the Russians ever secure Bakhmut, I think they'll probably then start properly pushing Ukrainians back from Donetsk city. There was a Russian attack which took over this town of Kamienka and some other positions right up along to the reservoir in the past couple days. This is sort of ringing alarm bells, because they also advanced further to the south towards this hamlet, this farming, this old collective farm here. Bypassing Avdiivka entirely, it seems to be that the Russians are starting to position themselves for potentially an encirclement of the town at some point in the future. So this push on the northern and southern axis of Avdiivka is starting to ring sort of alarm bells around the place, including to me that this might be the next big thing that the Russians are starting to eye, depending on how things in Bakhmut and elsewhere along the front go. So that's the biggest story. But other than that, there was a very large Russian missile strike across Ukraine, missile and drones, target the energy infrastructure. I believe the Ukrainians said that 88 drones and missiles were fired. The Ukrainians claim that they engaged 39 of them. Who knows? One way or the other, you can never really depend on either side to tell the truth on this stuff. Large infrastructure failures across Ukraine today: water, electric, internet, but not a complete blackout. But most crucially, it's Erendogar, the nuclear power plant, is still linked to the Ukrainian energy system, and all backup power to the nuclear power plant has been reported to be out of service. This is quite crucial because the cooling systems and the fail-safe systems for the nuclear reactors rely on this backup power. So that's ringing some big alarm bells today. Kind of the resumption of the nuclear power plant coming back into popular consciousness after a few months of nothing. And that's kind of the big things that I've noticed off the top of my head, but I was planning on saving that for a stream on Saturday. So yeah. So 2 B-52s over Bulgaria. Flying in circles. So, yeah, that's the big thing. So, opinion on the Nord Stream coats going on. I honestly don't really know what to think about Nord Stream. I would find it hard to believe that the Ukrainians got on a yacht and did everything without any kind of input from the Americans, especially. I find that a bit far-fetched. Karatakos Ustas for €5. Thank you so much. Do you think we're gonna see similar color revolutions in Kazakhstan or Turkey? No, I don't think so. The Kazakhs seem to be slowly moving out of Russia's orbit in and of themselves, and I think that the Kazakhs have the Chinese who will prevent any overt Russian attempts at Kazakhstan, but also via the natural drift of Kazakhstan. I don't think there's a need for a color revolution as such. Turkey, don't think so. I can't see the West instigating color revolutions in NATO powers, but also the polling for Erdogan is not looking very good for him. So given enough time in the upcoming Turkish elections, it looks like Erdogan is probably going to be ousted from power democratically, so there wouldn't be a need to oust him anyway. Plus, also, going by what happened with the Gulen movement's attempt at a coup back in 2016, I think the age of coups, domestic or foreign instigated, are probably over in Turkey. I can't see, or even revolutions as such. I think Turkish society is hardened against that, especially in the wake of the revolution. So, apparently this is not an insurrection and it is dangerous. Our democracy, yeah, of course. Do you see more color revolutions in the future, maybe in the Central Asia or the CAR? Who knows? And I think color revolutions specifically are former Soviet. With Melitopol, new capital in Russia, held Zaporozhye, do something similar will happen with Kherson, or will they unite both territories in the south? I think, yeah, you'll probably see a quote-unquote temporary administration in Kherson, but I can't see the Russians retaking Zaporozhye or Kherson anytime soon with the way they've been going about with things. So yeah, you'll probably see a reorganization of the administrative status of that area, and you'll probably just do away with Kherson and Zaporozhye and just reunite them into recreate the old Tauride province of the Russian imperial era, because it has a bit of historical claim to it that removes the overt Ukrainian legacy of Zaporozhye. And I guess it kind of separates Kherson Oblast from Kherson City, so that's something we could see. Please read my comment on the nuke plant above. It is in caps. Where? Whereabouts is it? I'm not seeing it. No, I'm afraid I'm not seeing it. I apologize. Not the super chat, is it? No. I apologize. I can't seem to find it. The nuclear power plant is built to shut down safely in case of external power loss. Weren't the nuclear power plant reactors shut off long ago? Can't link the article, but can find Zaporozhye plant shut down. From my understanding is it was still generating electricity, and it was still potentially generating power back into the Ukrainian grid, which was interesting. I'm not too sure in the specific status of the nuclear power plant, but even then, I would imagine a nuclear power plant that's in the middle of a war zone that has been shelled numerous times over the past 6 months. Something could have been damaged along the way, but yeah, it's just I'm not saying, and I don't think the implication is that because the backup power has failed that the nuclear power plant is going to go into meltdown. I think the problem is that it's just another stress added on to the systems alongside the stresses of what's happened from the shelling that's happened at the plant over the past couple of years, and the lower level of staffing, because obviously most of the staff has fled. So I think that's the concern there, is not necessarily the power loss itself, but that it's just another level of stress on the system. So, is there anything else? Is there anything I'm missing, chat? The only other thing that I can really think to bring off the top of my head is based Republikska Spurtska. The Bosnian part of the Serbian part of the Bosnian Federation is again threatening to succeed and become its own country, which is pretty based in red-pilled. So, so yeah, guys, I think that's, unless anyone has anything immediate they want to throw at me. I think I'm probably going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for everyone who very generously threw some coins. Well, more than a few coins in one case. Honestly, it's so generous. Thank you so much. I know some people bizarrely who follow my YouTube aren't in the Telegram group, which is where most of the stuff goes. So yeah, if you, where is my Telegram? If you aren't in there, yeah, this is my Telegram. I'll post it in the chat. This is where most of the stuff I do comes from. That's where the bulk of the stuff I do goes on, is in the Telegram group. So do get in there if you aren't already. Also follow me on Twitter. Come be a fellow twat with me at MDL Brock. And I don't think I'll show the Instagram, but yeah, come follow my stuff, guys, please. So with that, now you can play a computer game with your top donor. Totally, yes. Might start up some of the gaming streams again in a bit. Thank you. No, thank you. In fact, I'll post a link to my Twitter in chat, shouldn't I? And then, Telegram is fun. What would be your most desired ending to the war? I honestly don't know. Hard to say. The one that kills as less people and doesn't cause as much damage as possible. I don't know if I have a preferred ending to the war, to be honest. And it's not really my place to say either. I guess with that, guys, I'm going to wrap it up here, approaching 2.5 hours. I hope you guys enjoyed it. A bit more off the cuff and probably a bit more of my own personal views and takes and biases in this stream than I usually give. But the situation in Georgia is just pretty infuriating to watch play out. So, with that, I'm going to. Tomorrow I'm probably not going to stream. Might stream on Saturday, depending on what happens on the front. I might do an update stream on that, or I might do a gaming stream. I know I need to get Giza back to finish off the first forest, and then we need to do the second forest, the sequel, at some point. I don't know, I'll see how it goes. But with that, guys, I know I might be a bit cheeky saying this, but if you do like what I do, and you're not minded to throw a super chat, there are some links in the description to various ways: PayPal, Coffee, crypto, if that's your kind of thing, if you want to throw me a few coins. It all keeps it a bit more sustainable. Thank you very much to everyone who does throw me something. It's all appreciated, and thank you so much to the guys today. It honestly far too much. And I will speak to you guys in the near future. Everyone take care, take safe, and make sure Western NGOs are nowhere near your kids. So with that, have a good one, guys. Hopefully the clickbait title has brought in a few new people. See ya. What is it? Paka paka, as Russians say. Auf Wiedersehen. Have a good night, everyone. Speak to you soon.